Hi guys, Olive here. Today I'm here to do a book review for you in a little bit of a different way. In my last video, which was my August wrap-up and September TBR, I, throughout the video, enjoyed a solitary glass of wine. And since everyone, and I mean literally everyone, loved that video so much, I decided to do a book review of Back to Moscow by Guillermo Erades while taking shots of vodka. I'm not going to be having this whole bottle, obviously that would require hospitalization, but this is going to be a review told in between 3 shots. This book that I read is very layered, and I have a lot of things that I would like to say about it, and I think it would be amusing to do so in increasing levels of drunkenness. In the first part, I'm going to tell you about the plot. In the second part, we're going to talk about all the Russian literature that this book discusses. And in the third part, things are going to get weird, and we're going to talk Russia. So although this book takes place in Moscow, I have my St. Petersburg glass here because I've picked a side. I'm not taking full shots of this because I value my life. Also, this is Stoli Vanilla because I like it. Go reach out to them and tell them they should sponsor me. Ну, поехали. Okay. Ooh, vanilla. Where's the book? This is a book that was published in 2016, originally in the UK in March, and then here in the United States it was published in May. This book was published by FSG. I received it as an art copy, obviously, from Steve Donahue, who was kind enough to send me books for review every once in a while. I'm assuming he gets it from the publisher. I don't ask questions when I'm sent books for free in the mail. So the basic plot of this book is that we're following an expat living in Moscow. His name is Martin. I'm not sure we ever learn his nationality, but he natively speaks English. He comes to Moscow from Amsterdam. He has just recently had his heart broken by a longtime girlfriend, and he had applied at a Russian university, MGU, to study Russian literature. He receives the scholarships to study there, and so when we first meet Martin, he is just moving to Moscow to begin his studies. Martin is no expert in Russian literature, but he does know a great deal. He is particularly interested in Russian heroines in Russian literature. His research interests are trying to find out the ways in which modern Russian women are influenced by these Russian heroines. He moves to Russia at a time where Russia as a whole is changing a lot. The city of Moscow is changing a lot. It is the beginning of the 21st century. I believe he moves there in 1999. We follow him living in Russia up to, I think it's 2002. Being an expat, Martin is learning Russian, so there are a lot of transliterated Russian words within the text. He is interested in what makes the Russians Russian. He's also very interested in picking women up at clubs. That is a very large part of this book, Martin going to the club scenes and picking up women supposedly in the name of research and trying to figure them out in the ways in which they compare to the Russian heroines he knows so well. Throughout this book, multiple women cycle in and out of his life, which he seems to appreciate to varying degrees because he is largely shallow and self-absorbed. That being said, he is very observant about the Russian way of life, the Russian way of being, and he does have substantial knowledge about Russian literature, which leads us into part 2. I'm gonna die. Za literaturu. All right, we're doing it. Part number 2 of this review is going to talk about Russian language and literature throughout this book. I am not an expert in Russian literature by any means, but the way that Russian literature is discussed in this book through Martin's voice, since he is the one describing these novels to you, it makes Russian literature seem so appealing. The first chapter of each section of this book talks about a different Russian novel and a different Russian heroine from that novel. It basically summarizes, spoils that piece of literature, but talks about the woman's motivations, what happened to her, what she wanted, and really how, in her own way, she really characterizes Russianness and what it means to be a Russian. Probably the 2 most notable ones would be Tatiana from Eugene Onegin and then Anna from Anna Karenina. There are many other Russian heroines from other lesser-known novels that are discussed in this book. Most of the novels that he discusses I had already wanted to read or now want to read because they were talked about in this book. Each section of the book takes that piece of literature and compares it to what Martin is experiencing at the time. Like I said, Martin has different women cycle in and out of his life to varying degrees of importance, and some of them line up very closely with these different ideals of Russian women throughout the history of Russian literature. If you're at all familiar with Russian culture or Russian politics, you know that there has always been a divide, pretty much since the time of Peter the Great, of people who believe that Russia should be either more westernized or that they should remain inherently Russian. Colloquially, these groups tend to be known as either Westernizers or Russophiles. Oftentimes, in these novels that Martin is describing, a Russian woman will be shown as inherently Russian in a positive or negative way. This largely depends on the views of the author. So, for example, Tolstoy believes that staying true to one's true Russian nature is noble and good. And oftentimes, if a character is displayed as being Western or sophisticated, that they are corrupted, that they are betraying their true nature, that they are not to be trusted. When it comes to the Russian language that is in this book, like I said, there are quite a few words in here that are transliterated. And while I recognize those and could hear them being said in my head since I do speak some Russian, that was very enjoyable for me. I'm not sure if everyone would find it rewarding, but it certainly does make for a more immersive experience overall. It was also very engaging for me to watch Martin, an expat, a foreigner, living in Russia, studying in Russia, because that is something that I have done in the not too distant past, so there was a real connection there. I am not a Russian, and though I may study a lot about Russia and read a lot about Russia, I will never be a Russian, and it is always very interesting for me to see people on the same path as me trying to understand Russia more. And this will segue very nicely into the third section, where we're going to talk about all the Russianness that is contained within these pages. Number 3. You'd think it would get easier. I'm not holding up the book anymore. You know what it looks like. This book is dripping with Russia like an icicle in the springtime. Like I said, this book takes place at a period in Russia where a lot of critical things were happening. You are not too far separated from the collapse of the Soviet Union. Yeltsin, ironically, an alcoholic, has left office and put Putin in charge. The Soviet Union is far gone enough now, and the Russians have gone through enough with the transition to democracy, with the shock therapy, with the very tumultuous economic situation, with the loss of great power status, to start feeling very nostalgic about the Soviet era. You see this through some of Martin's professors, that they are lamenting that Russia is not like it used to be. Russia no longer has the reputation that it used to. Things are not as simple as they were in the Soviet times. It is also very interesting to think about the literature that Martin is talking about and the Westernizer versus Russophile debate in general, because in the early 2000s, at that point in Russian history, there's a lot of Westernizing that is happening. There are a lot of Western companies that are coming into Russia at that time. Russians are starting to dress and act more Western. People are not as concerned about each other anymore. It is more individualistic, which is very much the Western style of living. Some Russians have made it big. Some are oligarchs. Some took advantage of the mass privatization of industry and made themselves rich and are enjoying the spoils of that. And other people are struggling just to pay their rent. A lot of older people who were on state pensions no longer have a way to support themselves. A lot of people's life savings were absolutely wiped out by the inflation that took place during Russia's transition to a market economy. This author, though he is Spanish, has lived all over the world, including Moscow, which is so clear from reading this book that he has spent time with Russian people. Because from everything I know and my experience in Russia, there is a lot of nostalgia for the Soviet time, which I know for a lot of Americans and a lot of people around the world seems confusing. But for you, if you went from a time in which your life was stable, which is extremely important to the Russians, they have a very, very long history of instability in their country. If you went from a life that was stable, a life that you could predict, a life in which you were provided for, to a period of chaos where you didn't know if you were going to be able to afford to buy food the next day, wouldn't you feel nostalgic for that period of your life too? Yes, you would. This was also a very turbulent time politically in Moscow because of the Chechen Conflict. There were bombings in Moscow in the early 2000s that a lot of people believe were an inside job to provide justification for an attack on Chechnya. I can't imagine what it would have been like to live in Moscow at that time, but there was a lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty, adding to the already uncertain feelings that had come out of the 90s. So this book talks about all of those things, and it shows throughout the progression of the book just how much Moscow has changed, just how much Martin has changed along with Moscow. There is also a lot of discussion on what it means to be a Russian person. There are a lot of existential feelings, and one particular woman that Martin meets is very tortured. One of her lines is, "How do we know if our love is real if we don't suffer for it?" The Russian notion of toska, which means kind of an existential longing, a sadness, a despair. It's a word that cannot completely be translated. The concept of that word is discussed in this book. The need for a simple life versus a cosmopolitan life is discussed in this book. Is it better to want progress and success than it is to want a happy, simple life? Everything that I think about when I think about Russia is encapsulated in this book. And it might be partly because it's written by someone who is not themselves Russian. Like I said, through all of the reading and research that I do, I will never fully understand what it is to be Russian, or what it feels like to be Russian. But I do know what it is like to peer through the window and be constantly wondering what it must be like, what it must feel like. Martin does deal with a lot of women in this book, and he talks about them with his expat friends. And there is a lot of, we don't really understand what women want, they are a mystery to us, which is not a specifically Russian thing. I feel like men sometimes do talk this way about women. And I had a little bit of a realization that the way that men feel toward women is often the way that the West feels toward Russia. This kind of, we know you're different, we know you feel different, we know that you want something, but we don't quite know what it is, and we know there must be some sort of sense to your behavior, but we can't understand it, and thus we kind of think you're crazy. What the Russians want is not a huge mystery. It's what anybody else wants. What the Russians want is often just stability and respect. It's often much less complicated than what we Westerners desire. So to start to wrap all of this up, this book got me thinking about a lot of things. It made me feel a lot of Russian things, and I highly enjoyed it. I will say that I did have some problems with it because it wasn't entirely clear how quickly time was passing. I felt like the prose could have helped a little bit out there. And I also felt kind of skeevy feelings because Martin and his expat friends are very much out of clubs to kind of woman collect. They are just looking for women to sleep with, which really makes me uncomfortable. Martin can be a real jerk sometimes, especially when he's chasing tail, and I really just did not like that about him. Also, there were these meta elements sometimes where it was clear that some of these experiences were the author's, and he was saying things like, well, when I write my book on Moscow someday, and it was just like, please don't do that. That's not really necessary. These are all things that I think could be absolutely improved upon in his next book, which I will absolutely be reading. If this is in fact a novelization of his time spent in Moscow and his experiences with trying to understand the Russian people, I will be beyond interested and excited to read any other books that he writes that happens to be a novelization of his time spent in other places. Like I said in his bio, it says that he has lived in a number of places throughout his life. He is very observant. His writing is very good. I very, very much enjoyed this book, and I wish that I could recommend it to everybody, but I think you do need at least a background in one of the things that he talks about in this book, so Russian language, Russian culture, Russian politics, Russian literature. If you have some basis of a knowledge of one of those things, I think you can go into this and I think it will expose you to a lot of things. I went into this book without the Russian literature background, and I am sure that there are allusions that I missed because of that. I will be eager to go back and reread this after I have read some of those works. But I did have the background in the language, culture, and politics enough to make this a really special experience for me. This book was very poignant, very observant, very layered. It was a very enjoyable experience for me going through this and reawaking some of those feelings that I had, especially during college when I was doing the majority of my research on Russia. It has also been a blast to sit here semi-drunk and discuss Russia with you guys. I don't often go into depth about some of the things I know about Russia and the things I feel about Russia, so this has been a great opportunity for me to do it. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video. If you have any comments or questions for me, you can of course leave it in the comments section below. If you want to discuss things with me elsewhere or just want to follow me on social media, all the links to my profiles are in the description box below. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. До свидания.